All right, so now that we've talked about the different political institutions that exist within the governments, let's talk about how we populate those institutions, and that's through the electoral system. Not only the electoral system, but also we look at what influences the electoral system, and that's something called linkage institutions. All right, so there are three general types of elections. The first one is what you're most familiar with, and that is an election for public officials. So this is when the public, the individuals, vote for president, prime minister, members of the legislature, people who hold public office. However, there's other types of elections. One type of election we've already talked about, so there's a little bit of review. There is a referendum election, and this, remember, is when a simple question or public policy is given to the public, and the public simply votes yes or no, and whatever the majority answer is, that becomes binding law. So for instance, Scotland just had a referendum asking the public if they would like to leave the United Kingdom, and the public voted no. The majority said no, they would like to remain within the United Kingdom. So that was a referendum. It became a binding law based on the opinion of the majority of the citizens within Scotland. Also, a review, we talked about plebiscite. A plebiscite election is similar to a referendum in which a single question is given to the public and they're allowed a yes or no vote. However, the difference is this is simply to inform legislation and the public officials about the opinions of the public, but it's not a binding vote or a binding law afterwards. It's simply there to inform the public officials of how the citizens feel. A third type of election is something called an initiative. An initiative, unlike a referendum or a plebiscite, which is something that is an action taken by the legislature and they try to get the opinion of the public, an initiative instead is the public trying to influence the legislature or the government. An initiative most commonly is when people try to gather signatures on a petition on something that they view as very important, and they want the legislature or the government to care about it and debate it and possibly pass certain laws or policy about it. So an initiative is when people use petitions in order to show their support for certain issues, and then eventually, hopefully, this is passed along to the government and policy is passed. Now, what is the purpose of electoral systems? So we know that there are different types of elections, and we have electoral systems, and these electoral systems are more or less the laws that dictate how certain individuals are elected or how policy is passed. So the rules that decide how votes are cast, counted, and then how does this translate to who holds power within the government? There are different types of electoral systems. The first one is called plurality, and this is the one that we're probably the most used to because it's the simplest. Plurality simply means whoever gets the most votes wins. It doesn't mean you have to have a majority. 50% or more of the public doesn't need to support a single candidate. Instead, they simply have to have more votes than the other guys that are running. We also call this the first past the post type of election. This is a football reference, American football reference. In other words, it's whoever runs past the post first with the most votes, they get to hold the office. It's just a nickname. It's not super important, but sometimes it's referred to that as well. For this type of election, votes are cast for an individual, not for the party. So this is when you vote on a single member of parliament or a single member of Congress, or you vote for an individual president. You're not voting for the party. With this, it encourages something called a broad-based party. Now, a political party, we're going to define it a little bit later on, they're the ones attempting to get influence within the legislature. A broad-based party is one that attempts to appeal to the most people possible. They tend to support many different ideas. They're not narrow in their scope. They might care about certain economic policies, different social policies. They have opinions about a lot of things, and they do that in order to try to get the most votes possible. Aside from the plurality, we have something called proportional representation. This is something that's not quite as common. Instead of ballots being cast for an individual, ballots are instead cast for a party. So this creates multi-member districts, and bloop, 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 bloop. Let me try that again. All right, so aside from plurality elections, we also have something called proportional representation election system. In proportional representation, ballots are cast for a party, not for an individual. So you might vote for PT, but you don't actually vote for an individual politician. You vote for the party. What is the most important thing about the proportional representational system is this third bullet point there, is that the percentage of votes a party gets during the election determines how many seats they're going to have within the legislature. So, for instance, if 30% of all votes go to Payte, then Payte will have 30% of seats for the legislature. So it's proportional. However many votes that party gets is the number of seats that they're going to hold within the Congress, Parliament, legislature. So you can see that this is a positive because it actually encourages multiple parties. If your party only gets 1% of votes, then you're guaranteed to have at least 1% of the seats within the legislature. So this allows for a little bit more diversity than the plurality system that we just talked about. Then we have the mixed system. So just like the name says, this is a system that mixes both the plurality system as well as proportional system. So in this type of system, they might have individuals that the citizens get to vote for president. So you might vote directly or indirectly for the president as opposed to a party. But then in the legislature, you vote for a political party instead of an individual. And right now, the two biggest states that have this would be Mexico and Russia. So we're going to be talking about those electoral systems more in depth when we get to those units. All right, so aside from electoral systems, another way that we influence the government is through something called linkage institutions. Linkage institutions are those institutions which connect the government to its citizens. So this is through those political parties that we were just talking about. This is through something called special interest groups or interest groups, as well as the media, which obviously you're very familiar with. Things are published in the media and people are influenced by that. So political parties. Political parties are groups of people who work together to win elections and hold influence within the government. There's different types of systems. There's one-party systems, and this is most familiar in the modern world with communist states. For instance, China is a one-party system. All other political parties are outlawed within China. There's nothing else allowed. There's no competition within the government that's allowed. There's also one-party dominant systems. In a one-party dominant system, other political parties are allowed, but there tends to be one party that dominates the elections. Mexico is going to be the best example of this. We're going to talk about it when we get to that unit. But they have had one party, PRI, that have dominated the majority of the presidential elections as well as legislative seats over the 20th century. We also have this in Russia. Russia, as you read about in Freedom House, had hundreds of political parties, and then Putin came in, and all of a sudden it was reduced down to 7. The most dominant of these is the party that Putin belongs to, which is United Russia. So even though there's other parties, there's one that tends to dominate the majority of the elections. Then we have the system that's actually very, very rare, but it is the system that the United States uses, and that's the two-party system. The two-party system is when there are two parties that dominate. There might be many, many other parties, but they tend to have very little success in actually being elected. So this is most typical in the United States, where we have the Democrats and the Republicans. Sometimes we'll have independents or members of other parties that are voted in, but it's very rare. They have very little influence or presence. It's usually those two political parties that are head-to-head. And then we have multi-party systems. This is the one that's the most familiar. This is also the one that's we find primarily in the parliamentary system. This is when there's many different parties representing many different interests, and they're elected, are allowed to compete, and then are openly elected to the legislature. So it's not necessarily dominated by a couple parties. The other parties also have quite a bit of influence within the government. Aside from political parties, we also have interest groups. Interest groups are organizations of like-minded individuals, very similar to political parties. And just like political parties, they want to influence and shape public policy. The difference here, though, is an interest group can support candidates, but they do not actually run their own candidates. So this is unlike political parties. So like the Democratic Party in the United States, not only sponsors a candidate, but the candidate runs on that political party ticket. An interest group is simply a group that has a particular and focused interest, and they might throw their support behind a candidate from a political party, but they don't actually have political parties that support a specific candidate or run a candidate. Like there's no Greenpeace candidate. These are interest groups that support primarily one focused policy. They really want to push their agenda in creating legislature or protecting legislature. And there's different influences depending on what kind of regime exists. So this again is a review. Within an authoritarian regime, we have something called state corporatism. Within state corporatism, there's very little influence from the outside world, right? Individuals, for the most part, don't even have any kind of influence on their government. So because of this, in authoritarian regimes, interest groups are limited, and they're kind of selected very carefully by the state, and only a few interest groups are allowed to have any kind of say or place at the table within the government. Democracies are a little bit different. We know that they tend to practice pluralism, which is a way of saying everybody's welcome into the pool, everybody has influence, and there's many different interest groups all competing for influence, all competing to get the attention of the different politicians. Now, there's a different type of corporatism that we'll hear throughout this course, and that's something called neo-corporatism. This happens when there's an extremely powerful interest group or corporation, let's say maybe an oil corporation, that has a lot of influence on policy making. So not only are they an interest group, but they're an interest group that has quite a bit of power within the government. A final linkage institution that's important to know, and it's probably the most or obvious out of them, is the media. The media is probably the most important linkage institution in informing the people about the elections, informing them about the politicians, and also influencing them. This is used by politicians. We see this as a way to transmit their ideas, also called a platform, to the public. So we see this in campaigns. We see this now through social media, the use of Facebook, the use of Twitter. But also, it's a way to update the public on the actions taken by elected officials. This might be through the news corporations, where they tell you a certain policy was just passed or a certain politician is supporting a certain policy. And this really influences public opinion to the point that it can determine elections simply based on media coverage. All right, so this was a quick lecture on the types of electoral systems as well as linkage systems. Please play back if you need to, and let me know if you have any questions.